In the United States and the US alone, a female politician or journalist is harassed on Twitter every 30 seconds. And the majority of the harassing tweets are coming from trolls and bots. Maybe you're wondering, well, isn't the same happening to male candidates and to male politicians? To find this out, I partnered with an artificial intelligence company, Marvelous AI, and we looked at 4 months of these US Democratic primaries. And what we found is that, in fact, female candidates are much more attacked by fake news accounts, and that the attacks against them are much more vicious, really looking at their personal traits and personalities as opposed to their policy proposals or ideas. Research shows that the same is happening in countries all over the world, as diverse and far apart as Italy and India, the Philippines, and Ukraine. It's a sobering reality, and for me, is also a personal one. When I was a political activist in Italy, I remember being attacked pretty much every time I posted anything on social media with attacks that were misogynist and sexist. And then I remember the more disturbing emails with threats to my life and personal safety, and not knowing whether I should delete them from my inbox, hoping they would be erased forever from my mind too, or I should try to find justice knowing that was never going to happen. And I remember wondering, is the cost of political engagement simply too high? Now, this is the question that millions of women politicians and political activists are asking themselves right now around the world, and we cannot afford for their answer to be no. We also cannot afford just to tell them, well, delete your social media account and everything is going to be fine. Because for many of them, social media is still the only tool they have to overcome the invisibility and bias they face on traditional media outlets that are often owned by oligarchs. With this in mind, I wrote She Persisted, Women, Politics and Power in the New Media World, because I wanted to find a response to 3 questions that have been with me for a long time. Number 1, what is really the relationship between women politicians and social media? And I wanted to hear that from the very own voices of women political leaders all over the world. The second question, what can be done to improve things and really ensure that social media can be a tool to promote more inclusive and participatory democracies? And finally, why has so little been done on this issue? To respond to the first question around the relationship between women political leaders and social media, I interviewed dozens of women in politics from 30 countries around the world. And a word that kept coming up over and over again, as Stephenie pointed, was double-edged sword. From Julia Gillard to the former Prime Minister of Slovenia, Alenka Bratušek, I kept hearing that truly social media is a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it does provide incredible avenues for being in contact with one's constituency. And really, Alenka, for example, told me that her political career would have not been the same without social media, because it was very, very hard for a woman from a minority political party to be really taken into consideration from traditional media outlets. So on the one hand, there are advantages. On the other hand, though, another word that kept coming up was just overwhelming. The amount of time and effort that it takes for a woman in politics to defend her own reputation is overwhelming. And the toll on their emotional well-being is very, very heavy. So, can we improve things? Absolutely. There are many best practices, solutions, and innovations that can be applied, and everyone has a role to play. For sure, social media companies must revisit their policies on fake news, user accountability, And finally, use technological innovations to detect and tackle bias and harassment. Political parties must adopt codes of conduct of what's an acceptable behavior and language on social media. Policymakers must look into opportunities to regulate and also must promote digital literacy to ensure that citizens become conscious consumers of information. And finally, we must all fight to ensure that women are represented at 50% of decision-making worldwide. Because let us be clear, we would never be in this situation if women led and owned 50% of social media companies worldwide. We would never be in this situation if women were representing 50% of national parliamentarians worldwide. And so, because we know the problem, and because there are some solutions, why not more has been done? There is another set of actors that I haven't talked about yet that hasn't quite done their fair share. And those are the advocates, the watchdogs, the academic institutions, the think tanks, the big philanthropists that, with few exceptions, have overlooked this problem. And while they are rightfully investing millions of dollars to look at the intersection of democracy and technology, they are mostly or entirely doing so in a way that often is deaf and blind to the realities of women in politics worldwide. And this is despite we all know that the very same forces that are attacking minority rights and the very same anti-democratic forces that are trying to weaken our institutions, they are those same forces that are trying to silence women. Paradoxically, those forces have understood something that many think tanks and academic institutions and donors that really care about democracy seem not to have understood, which is that you cannot have strong participatory democracies leaving aside 50% of the population, and that social media can be used effectively to bring women in or push them out. And finally, I would like to leave you with a question to really frame this next hour or so that we're going to spend together, and hopefully that you will bring along in the next weeks and months and years ahead, and through various elections. And this is what is so transformative, revolutionary, maybe even dangerous about women's political leadership, that autocrats and anti-democracy forces all over the world would go at great length to try and make sure that women don't have a seat at the table, and what would be possible if they did.